I thought it might be nice to give people on the panel an opportunity if they wanted to respond to anything that the other panelists have said, anything that sparked a comment for you or that you wanted to seek some clarification of the other panelists. If not, I'm going to jump in. Go ahead, Nick.
If I could add, I think we have to remember the frame for everyone is that they don't trust anyone. They don't trust the government. They don't trust companies. They don't trust, and that's the fundamental frame that any project has to deal with. It's kind of like, think of it this way, if people don't trust democracy to help them just live and get ahead, why would they trust an energy project? And I think one of the challenges, I think, is, at least for the polling that we've done, is that people want a frank discussion on the trade-offs and also the risks, right? The economic trade-offs and also the environmental risks related to a project, and they want to hear about that. And I think, when those are dealt with directly, I think you're more likely to get people engaged in the process. But it's very difficult to do because if on the one hand, someone is a proponent for a project, your objective is to have your project move forward. But at the same time, I think the trick is to have balance in the dialogue in terms of the choices that people have, energy choices that people have and need, and also choices related to jobs and choices related to the environment.
Does anybody want in on that? Because if not, I wanted to take it somewhere. Yeah, David.
Well, I was just going to ask Nick in a way that if this becomes a polarizing issue, or climate particularly becomes a highly partisan issue, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that as a society?
I think it comes down to, this goes back to, people have a default on a lot of these issues. I think what maybe we forget is that what we usually see in the news are usually not necessarily, at least from a Canadian public opinion perspective, the silent majority, who don't actually feel strongly about a lot of these projects. But they know when something isn't working right. So, I think, one of the things that needs to happen is just some sort of dialogue. And, one of these things, one of the challenges with carbon pricing, and, maybe this is unfair, policymakers will probably cringe when I say this, is that it's too complicated for an average person to understand. And when you don't understand something, it's hard to embrace something that you don't understand. And I think, so not only do we need to kind of engage in a dialogue and educate people, we have to kind of communicate in a way where they can understand and make choices in terms of whether they support a project or potentially oppose a project.
But I want to jump in on that because the question that David asked was I think really about climate and climate policy. Nick, your comments, at least initially, were about an energy project and people engaging in an energy project. One of the things that we've really found at Positive Energy is that you got to have the right forum to have the right conversation. And in many instances, what we're seeing is energy project decision-making processes, and I can imagine, Doug, you've experienced this on a few occasions, energy project decision-making processes are then utilized as the forum to talk about much broader questions of public policy, whether those are climate, reconciliation, cumulative effects management. So is there, in the Canadian context, I'll throw out a question for the group then, is part of what's missing to have that broader conversation? Yeah. Are we missing an energy vision?
How can you get anyone to buy into a project when they don't know how it fits into the future? How can you do that, right? You can't.
It's a great question.
No, you can't, because so if there's a project, there needs to be an explanation on how it fits into the future in terms of our aspirations for the economy, our aspirations related to the environment, our aspirations in terms of the types of communities we want to live in. And the thing is that many times if you can get people to buy into the destination, they're probably willing to accept some things that in isolation they might feel uncomfortable with. But you have to, and I think what we're lacking in Canada is an understanding of what that destination is. And I think that's where, we need the kind of convening power of kind of everyone to come together to say, okay, you know, maybe you don't like this, but here's how it fits into our long-term strategy for our country and how it fits into kind of our kind of engagement of communities and stakeholders and stuff like that.
Other thoughts on that? I mean, Nick, you're clearly putting down a marker there. We need an energy vision for the country. What do other folks think?
I think it's important that we all agree on the vision, or many people in this room would agree on the vision, the end point. But the point is the credibility of the waypoints along the way. And if you can't establish that there's progress, then there's the suspicion and distrust that says you're putting it out 50 years. Not all of us are going to be here in 50 years. And in any case, it's really about the fact that I don't see how you're going to be measured and accountable along that path. Therefore, I distrust the vision because I don't think you can achieve it. You haven't told me how you're going to get there.
So how do we get there?
Well, how do you have politicians who are geared towards a 4-year mandate to agree on a long-term vision? How do you, maybe that's a bigger question, right? Because structurally, our system is not built for, you know, why don't we just call it the way it is? Our system is not built for long-term planning because, you know, because governments change. How can communities make decisions? How can businesses make decisions when they're dealing in an uncertain political environment?
Well, I mean, this is where we're going to go with the next 3 years of positive energy is trust in energy transition decision-making processes, which by their very nature need to be long-term. David, I think I saw you wanting to jump in.
This is really a nightmare issue for politicians, and Nick has hit on it. It's not. It's what you're actually asking people to do is to inflict pain now in order to prevent something from happening in 3 or 4 elections' time. I can't imagine a less appetizing political cocktail to drink from. And there are countries that have done it, and it's interesting and instructive to ask why this is going much faster in Europe than it's done here, and where there is a much more ingrown belief that climate change is a huge challenge and they have to do something about it. And it also varies obviously across Canada, much different in Quebec than it does in the rest of the country. But the political calculation for a guy like Jim Carr must be nightmarish. You wake up in the middle of the night wondering how you're actually going to sell this to your cabinet colleagues, let alone to the voters.
Doug, did you want to?
Well, I think the complexity here goes also that Canada, being a big energy producing nation, it makes it a much more complex issue. Some of the countries that have been out front on this are energy importers. And to some degree, they received economic benefit by more leveling the playing field. Where for politicians here, they're trying to balance all of these agendas, whether it's the concern about climate, the concern about jobs, the concern about government revenues. So it is quite complex. I think if I spoke from industry's perspective, though, when you make up policy on individual projects, it will result in fewer projects. It's a high degree of risk. What industry would prefer to do is see policy translated into regulation, and then we can make decisions if we believe we can achieve the requirements and the expectations in the regulation. And then capital will flow where it flows. That'll be the outcome of that. But today, I think what we find ourselves in Canada is as we're trying to wander through this space, policies being picked up on the next piece of business that's in front of us. And the net result of that is we're 4 years of declining investment, 2 years of declining exports in the country. And so I think, and that will ultimately show up in the polls. That will ultimately show up in the polls. So there does need to be a foundation established. And maybe the last point is the challenge with this issue as well is all the variables around it are not static. We've actually seen that. Our industry, the shale revolution, has moved the world from this energy scarcity to abundance. That people didn't see that coming 10 years ago, but now it's actually changed geopolitics. The cost of alternatives is coming down. That's shifting it too. The expectations about economic growth in developing nations is a big factor in this conversation. So it is very difficult to create a framework which recognizes these variables are going to change and shift over time as you move forward.
Kim, can I put you on the spot on some of this stuff? And we had a preparatory teleconference for this, and one of the things that you talked about in that session was, you know, when it comes to forward-looking issues, and I think you alluded to it in your remarks, that, you know, that we have sort of policy and political processes moving along. At the same time, we have projects kind of moving through former decision-making systems. And I think the word you used at that time was a roadmap. We're missing a roadmap for going forward. I recognize you can only bring an Indigenous perspective to this, but I'd love to hear you a little bit more on that if you could. What's missing?
Well, I think it's twofold from my perspective. You have Canada struggling with climate change and sorting out a vision for how to move forward on one stream, and the other stream is Canada struggling on how to resolve Indigenous rights in Canada as well. So it's compounding for First Nations trying to engage in this stuff either through the regulatory process or other processes in advancing their issues. Many communities want to participate, but it's super challenging when all the rules are constantly changing and there is no roadmap and there is no sense of whether engagement is actually going to meet your community's needs as well. So I think as Canada is sorting out its longer term institutions and policies and processes as an evolving young country, it still has to sort out how it engages with Indigenous people at the same time.
And again, not to put you on the spot, but I think I'm going to. Are there particular ideas or steps or mechanisms that you would see, because we're trying in as much as we can at this conference to identify some, you know, kind of concrete action items. Are there particular steps you would see as being useful in that process, whether it's roles that governments or others could play?
Well, there's many successes across the country. They aren't entrenched in laws or policies, but you know the basis is from collaboration, whether it be between industry, government, and First Nations is more my background. There's agreements reached every day. So I think there's lots to learn from those spots in the country that are succeeding.
Okay. Terrific.